The roar of a pistol shot shattered the early morning calm of Twin Pines, Colorado, sending Hannah Blackburn diving behind an overturned water trough as splinters of wood exploded near her head. She wasn't supposed to die today, not in 1876. Not in a town she'd never set foot in before yesterday, and certainly not before she'd delivered the letter tucked safely inside her boot. The journey from Boston had been arduous enough without having to dodge bullets on her first full day in the West. "Get outta here, you filthy soiled dove!" A man's voice bellowed from the direction of the general store. "We don't want your kind in Twin Pines." Hannah's cheeks burned with indignation. The assumption that she was a prostitute simply because she was a woman traveling alone was as predictable as it was infuriating. She'd heard the whispers since stepping off the stagecoach, whispers that had evidently grown to gunshots by morning. "I'm not what you think," she shouted back, clutching her carpet bag to her chest. Inside were her few remaining possessions: 2 dresses, her mother's silver hairbrush, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, and $43, all that remained of her inheritance. "I'm here to deliver a letter to my cousin's widow." "Liar!" Another shot rang out, this one punching through the wooden trough. Hannah flinched, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake coming west. After her parents' death from influenza last winter, the modest Boston home she'd grown up in had been sold to pay their debts. With nowhere else to go, she'd remembered her distant cousin James, who had moved west years ago. When she'd learned of his recent death, Hannah had decided to journey to Twin Pines to offer condolences to his widow and perhaps, secretly, to ask for shelter until she could establish herself. Now, trapped behind a water trough with an angry shopkeeper taking potshots at her, those plans seemed foolishly optimistic. "That's enough, Perkins." A deep voice cut through the tension. "Put that gun away before you hurt someone who matters." The shooting stopped. Hannah cautiously peered around the edge of the trough to see a tall figure standing between her and the shopkeeper. The morning sun silhouetted his broad shoulders and the distinctive shape of a cowboy hat. He stood with a casual confidence, one hand resting on the holstered gun at his hip. "She's a harlot, Sullivan. Look at her." Perkins gestured wildly toward Hannah with his pistol. The cowboy Sullivan didn't even turn to look at her. "I don't care if she's the Queen of England or the devil's own daughter. We don't shoot at women in this town." "But Valentine, but nothing," Sullivan Valentine interrupted, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Go back inside, Perkins. I'll handle this." The shopkeeper hesitated, then spat on the ground and retreated into his store, slamming the door behind him. Only then did Sullivan Valentine turn to look at Hannah, who was cautiously rising to her feet, brushing dust from her travel-worn skirt. She found herself looking up into the most startling pair of blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-weathered face framed by dark hair that curled slightly where it met the collar of his shirt. "You all right, miss?" he asked, removing his hat and revealing more of that unruly dark hair. Hannah straightened her spine, determined not to appear as shaken as she felt. "I am unharmed. Thank you, Mr. Valentine." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Just Valentine to most folks. Sullivan Valentine to my mother when she was cross with me." "Well, Mr. Valentine," Hannah insisted on the formality, "I appreciate your intervention, but I assure you I am perfectly capable of getting shot," he finished for her, replacing his hat, "because that's what was about to happen. Perkins is a lousy shot when he's calm, and he was anything but calm just now." Hannah clutched her carpetbag tighter. "I was merely trying to inquire about my cousin's widow. I've come all the way from Boston to find her." Sullivan's expression changed, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. "You're looking for Eliza Blackburn?" "Yes, James Blackburn was my cousin. I've brought a letter from his family back east." Sullivan's face darkened. "Eliza died 3 months ago. Childbed fever. The baby too." The news hit Hannah like a physical blow. Her last hope of finding family gone. Her legs suddenly felt weak, and she stumbled slightly. Sullivan moved quickly, catching her elbow to steady her. "Whoa there. I'm sorry," Hannah murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. "It's just that I had hoped. I didn't know where else to go." Sullivan studied her face, his expression unreadable. "You've got nowhere to stay, no money, and half the town already thinks you're a prostitute," he summarized bluntly. Hannah flinched at his directness but lifted her chin. "I have $43, sir, and I am a trained schoolteacher. I will find my way." A short, humorless laugh escaped him. "Not in Twin Pines, you won't. This town decided what you are the moment you stepped off that stage alone. That's absurd. Surely once I explain, folks out here don't much care for explanations, Mississippi?" "Blackburn. Hannah Blackburn." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Related to James by blood, then. Second cousins. Our fathers were cousins." Sullivan looked down the dusty main street, seeming to consider something. "Miss Blackburn, Twin Pines isn't kind to women without protection. You'd be wise to take the next stage out tomorrow." Hannah felt a flash of anger. "And go where, Mr. Valentine? I've spent nearly everything I have just getting here." He sighed, pushing his hat back slightly. "I've got a small ranch about 3 miles outside town. There's an old cabin on the property where the previous owner's mother lived. It's not much, but it's solid. You could stay there until you figure things out." Hannah stared at him, suspicious. "Why would you offer shelter to a complete stranger?" "I knew your cousin," Sullivan said simply. "James was a good man. Helped me when I first came to these parts. Besides," his mouth quirked in a half-smile, "I've got a sister back east. I'd hope someone would do the same for her if she were in your boots." Hannah hesitated. The offer seemed too convenient, too generous. Yet what choice did she have? "I couldn't accept charity, Mr. Valentine." "Then don't." "The schoolteacher left town last month. Married a silver miner from Durango. The school board's desperate." "You said you're trained." Hope flickered inside her. "I taught for 3 years in Boston." Sullivan nodded. "Then you can earn your keep. Stay in the cabin, apply for the teaching position. I'll vouch for you with the school board." "And what would you expect in return?" Hannah asked cautiously. His eyes hardened. "Nothing improper, if that's what you're asking. Just some help with correspondence and bookkeeping for the ranch. I can read well enough, but writing gives me fits." Hannah studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. Everything about this man was direct from his speech to his steady gaze. If he harbored ulterior motives, he hid them well. "Very well, Mr. Valentine. I accept your offer temporarily, until I can secure proper employment and lodgings in town." "Good," he said, seeming relieved. "My wagon's at the livery. I'll fetch it and meet you back here in 20 minutes. As Sullivan walked away, Hannah suddenly realized the street had gone quiet. Looking around, she noticed faces in various windows and doorways watching, judging. One woman near the dressmaker's shop made a point of pulling her young daughter closer as she passed, as though Hannah were carrying some contagious disease. For the first time, the full weight of her situation pressed down on her. She was alone in a strange town where her reputation had been decided before she'd spoken a single word. Her planned refuge with her cousin's widow had evaporated. She was now dependent on the goodwill of a cowboy she'd met minutes ago. Yet something about Sullivan Valentine's straightforward manner gave her hope. At least she would have shelter tonight. Tomorrow's problems could wait until tomorrow. When Sullivan returned with a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses, Hannah was waiting with her carpetbag, her face composed despite the stares of townspeople who had gathered to witness her departure. As he helped her onto the wagon seat, Sullivan leaned in slightly. "Hold your head high, Miss Blackburn," he said quietly. Don't let them see they've rattled you. Hannah squared her shoulders and settled her hands primly in her lap as Sullivan took the reins. As they rolled out of Twin Pines, she felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. What awaited her at Sullivan Valentine's ranch was unknown, but it had to be better than the reception she'd received in town. What she didn't notice as they departed was the contemplative look Sullivan gave her when he thought she wasn't watching, a look that suggested he wasn't entirely sure what he'd just gotten himself into, either. The journey to Sullivan Valentine's ranch passed in relative silence. Hannah observed the changing landscape as they left Twin Pines behind, the dusty streets giving way to open prairie dotted with scrubby junipers and sagebrush. In the distance, mountains rose in purple majesty against the brilliant blue Colorado sky. "It's beautiful," she murmured, almost to herself. Sullivan glanced at her, then back to the trail. "Gets in your blood. I came out here thinking I'd earn some quick money and head back east. That was 7 years ago. What made you stay?" Hannah asked, genuinely curious. He gestured toward the vast openness around them. "Space to breathe. To build something that's mine." As the wagon crested a gentle rise, Sullivan's ranch came into view. It wasn't as grand as Hannah had imagined, a modest main house with a barn, corral, and several outbuildings spread across a small valley. A creek snaked through the property, lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. About 50 cattle grazed on the surrounding grassland, with a few horses in a separate paddock. "It's not much compared to some spreads," Sullivan said, noticing her assessment. "But it's paid for and it's mine." There was unmistakable pride in his voice that Hannah found herself respecting. "You've built this all yourself?" "Most of it. Hired help for the bigger projects." He pointed toward a small cabin set apart from the main house, partially nestled among trees near the creek. "That'll be your place." As they drew closer, Hannah could see the cabin was rustic but solid-looking. What caught her attention, though, was that it lacked a proper porch, just a small stoop before the door. Sullivan brought the wagon to a halt near the main house and helped Hannah down. A ranch hand emerged from the barn, a weathered older man with a limp and silver hair peeking out from beneath his hat. "Hank, this is Miss Blackburn," Sullivan called out. "She'll be staying in Martha's old cabin for a spell." Hank studied Hannah openly, touching his hat brim in greeting. "Madam." His tone gave nothing away about what he thought of her sudden appearance. "Miss Blackburn is James's cousin from back east," Sullivan added, the simple statement carrying weight that Hannah didn't fully understand until she saw Hank's demeanor immediately soften. "James was good people," Hank said, his expression warming. "Any kin of his is welcome here." Hannah felt a small knot of tension release. At least one person besides Sullivan wouldn't be judging her harshly. "Thank you, mister." "Just Hank, madam. Been working for Mr. Valentine here since he bought this place. Used to work for Old Man Ellison before that." Sullivan picked up Hannah's carpetbag. "I'll show Miss Blackburn to the cabin. When Pedro gets back with the supplies, have him bring the flour and sugar I ordered to the cabin instead of the main house." Hank nodded and returned to his tasks as Sullivan led Hannah along a well-worn path toward her new temporary home. The late morning sun was hot on her back, making her appreciate the shade of the cottonwoods as they approached the cabin. "It needs some work," Sullivan said as they reached the small structure. "Been empty since Martha Ellison passed 2 years back. But the roof's sound, and there's a good stove inside." Hannah waited as he pushed open the door, which creaked in protest. The interior was dusty but surprisingly spacious, one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a curtained alcove that presumably contained a bed. Simple furnishings, all draped with sheets to protect them from dust, gave the place a ghostly appearance. "I'll send Hank's wife Maria over to help you clean up," Sullivan said, placing her carpetbag on a covered table. She comes in from their place a few miles over to cook and clean for us 3 times a week. Hannah moved to the single window, wiping dust from the glass to look outside. It's more than adequate, Mr. Valentine. Thank you. Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. There's an outhouse around back. Creek's clean for washing and such. We'll bring water for drinking and cooking. Hannah turned to face him, suddenly struck by the strangeness of her situation. Just yesterday, she had been on a stagecoach, full of hopes about reuniting with her cousin's family. Now she was standing in a dusty cabin on a stranger's ranch, with no clear path forward. Mr. Valentine, she said carefully, I appreciate your generosity, but I'm still not entirely clear on why you're doing this. Sullivan studied her for a long moment before answering. When I first came out here, I was greener than spring grass. Made every mistake you could make. Would have lost everything if not for folks like your cousin James who gave me a chance. He paused. Besides, Twin Pines isn't always kind to outsiders, especially women traveling alone. So I discovered, Hannah said dryly. A brief smile flashed across Sullivan's face. I'll have Pedro bring over some provisions. The water barrel should be full enough to get you started. Maria will come by this afternoon. He moved toward the door, then hesitated. That teaching position the school board meets Thursday evenings at the church. I'll take you in if you're interested. I am. Very much so, Hannah affirmed. Good. Sullivan nodded, seeming satisfied. I've got work to see to. Make yourself at home, Miss Blackburn. After he left, Hannah stood motionless in the center of the cabin, overwhelmed by the sudden quiet. She removed her bonnet and placed it on the table beside her carpetbag, then methodically began pulling the sheets off the furniture, raising clouds of dust that danced in the sunbeams streaming through the window. The task gave her something concrete to focus on while her mind processed the dramatic turns her life had taken. By the time she had uncovered all the furniture, a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, a small sideboard, and a narrow bed in the alcove, Hannah had regained some of her equilibrium. The cabin was basic but had everything she needed. The mattress would need airing, the floors sweeping, and every surface required a thorough dusting. But it was shelter. More importantly, it was somewhere she could catch her breath and plan her next steps. Hannah found a broom in the corner and was vigorously sweeping when a knock at the door interrupted her. A round-faced Mexican woman of perhaps 50 stood there, arms full of cleaning supplies. Miss Blackburn? I am Maria. Senor Valentine say you need help with cabin. Hannah felt a wave of relief at the woman's friendly smile. Please come in. And it's Hannah. Maria entered, surveying the half-clean space with an expert eye. Mucho trabajo, much work, but we make nice, see? Then you feel at home. For the next few hours, Hannah and Maria worked side by side, scrubbing, dusting, and organizing. Maria chattered as they worked, her English accented but clear, telling Hannah about her 6 grown children, her 12 grandchildren, and how she'd come to work for Senor Valentine after her husband Hank had been injured in a cattle drive 3 years ago. He good man, Maria said firmly as they hung the freshly beaten mattress outside to air. Not like some ranchers. He pay fair, respect Hank even after injury. When Pedro, my youngest boy, need work, Senor Valentine hire him too. Hannah was beginning to realize that Sullivan Valentine wasn't simply being charitable toward her. Kindness seemed to be an established pattern with him, albeit hidden beneath a gruff exterior. Later that afternoon, Pedro arrived with supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, beans, salt pork, and other staples. The young man was polite but shy, barely meeting Hannah's eyes as he carried in the provisions and a large water barrel. As evening approached, Maria prepared a simple supper before departing, promising to return in 2 days. Hannah sat alone at the clean table, eating the hearty bean stew Maria had left, trying to ignore the growing silence as darkness fell. After washing her dishes, Hannah lit the lamp Maria had filled with oil and sat in the rocking chair, feeling the events of the day catch up with her. Exhaustion swept over her in waves, yet sleep seemed impossible. The unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night coyotes in the distance, the rustle of wind through cottonwood leaves, the occasional lowing of cattle kept her senses alert. A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Opening it cautiously, she found Sullivan standing there, hat in hand, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her a small revolver. "It's loaded. For protection." Hannah stared at the weapon. In Boston, she'd never touched a gun. "I don't know how to use it," she admitted. "Point and pull the trigger," Sullivan said bluntly. "If something or someone threatens you, aim for the center and squeeze. But mostly, having it nearby will help you sleep better." Hesitantly, she accepted the gun, surprised by its weight. "Thank you. Is it necessary out here?" Sullivan shrugged. "Probably not. Ranch is safe enough. But better to have it and not need it." Hannah placed the revolver on the small table beside her bed, then rejoined Sullivan at the door. He seemed reluctant to leave, glancing around the cabin. "Maria got you settled in all right?" "Yes, she was wonderful. The cabin is quite comfortable now." Sullivan nodded, his eyes briefly meeting hers before looking away. "Good. That's good." He settled his hat back on his head. "If you need anything, main house isn't far. Just give a holler." "I will. Thank you again, Mr. Valentine." Something like a smile flickered across his face. "Sullivan, if you're going to be staying on my ranch, might as well use my name." "Sullivan," she repeated, testing the familiarity of it. He tipped his hat and turned to go, then paused. "This cabin could use a proper porch. Place for sitting in the evenings. I'll see about building one soon." Before Hannah could respond, he was striding away into the darkness, leaving her to wonder at the unexpected offer. A porch seemed like a permanent addition to make for someone who was only staying temporarily. Perhaps Sullivan Valentine expected her temporary arrangement to last longer than she did. Closing and latching the door, Hannah prepared for bed, her mind still processing the day's events. As she lay on the freshly aired mattress, listening to the night sounds, she realized that despite everything, she felt safer than she had since leaving Boston. There was something reassuring about Sullivan Valentine's straightforward manner and quiet competence. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin writing a formal application for the teaching position. If she secured it, she could eventually afford a small place in town, assuming the townspeople's attitudes toward her changed. And if they didn't, Hannah pushed the thought away. One day at a time, she fell asleep to the distant sound of a coyote's howl, her hand resting near the revolver she hoped never to use. The next few days established a rhythm to Hannah's new life. Each morning, she rose with the sun, washed at the creek, and prepared a simple breakfast. Then she would work on her teaching application, meticulously outlining her qualifications and experience. In the afternoons, she helped Maria with various household tasks, learning the practicalities of ranch life that her Boston upbringing had never prepared her for. Sullivan was rarely present, busy with ranch work from dawn until dusk. When their paths did cross, their interactions were brief but increasingly comfortable. He would inquire about her comfort, she would assure him all was well, and they would part ways until the next fleeting encounter. On her fourth day at the ranch, Hannah was returning from the creek with freshly washed linens when she noticed a wagon loaded with lumber parked near her cabin. Sullivan and Pedro were unloading the wood, stacking it neatly. "What's all this?" she called out, approaching them with her basket of damp sheets. Sullivan straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "Porch materials. Figured I'd start today." Hannah set down her basket. You were serious about building a porch? I don't generally say things I don't mean, Miss Blackburn. There was no offense in his tone, just that matter-of-fact directness she was coming to expect from him. Hannah, she corrected him. If I'm to call you Sullivan, you should call me Hannah. A brief smile crossed his face. Hannah, then. She gestured to the lumber. This seems like a lot of work for a temporary arrangement. Sullivan shrugged. Cabin needed a porch long before you arrived. Martha always wanted one. I'm just finally getting around to it. Hannah sensed there was more to it than that but didn't press. Can I help? Sullivan and Pedro exchanged glances. You know anything about building porches? Sullivan asked skeptically. I can learn, Hannah replied, lifting her chin slightly. I'm not afraid of hard work. Sullivan seemed to consider this, then nodded. All right then, you can help Pedro measure and cut. I'll show you how. For the rest of the afternoon, Hannah worked alongside the two men, measuring lumber, holding boards in place, and even learning to hammer nails. Her hands, soft from years of teaching and genteel Boston living, quickly accumulated blisters and splinters, but she refused to complain. There was something deeply satisfying about the physical work, about seeing the porch take shape board by board. By sunset, the frame was complete, a simple rectangular structure extending about 8 feet from the front of the cabin. Sullivan studied their work critically, then nodded in satisfaction. We'll finish the decking and railings tomorrow, he announced. Should be done by evening. As Pedro gathered the tools, Sullivan noticed Hannah examining her blistered hands. You should soak those in cool water, he said, his voice gentler than she'd heard before. Maria has a salve that helps with blisters. Hannah curled her fingers, embarrassed at her obvious inexperience. I'll toughen up quickly enough. Sullivan's mouth quirked in an almost smile. No doubt about that. You're not what I expected, Hannah Blackburn. What did you expect? She asked curiously. He considered his answer carefully. Someone who'd be crying to go back east by now. Hannah laughed softly. I may yet, but not because of blisters or hard work. Sullivan's expression sobered. Thursday's school board meeting is day after tomorrow. You ready? As ready as I'll ever be. I finished my application and prepared answers for likely questions. It's not just about qualifications, Sullivan warned. Some folks in town have already made up their minds about you. Hannah sighed. Because I'm a woman traveling alone. Sullivan nodded. That, and people here are wary of outsiders in general. Takes time to be accepted. Will you truly vouch for me? Hannah asked, suddenly uncertain. I said I would. His tone suggested that should be enough. Hannah wanted to ask more about how much influence he had in town, about why people might listen to him, but Pedro returned, interrupting the moment. As Sullivan and Pedro departed for the main house, Hannah soaked her hands in cool water from the creek as suggested, thinking about Sullivan Valentine. He remained something of a mystery to her, a taciturn cowboy who seemed determined to help her for reasons she still didn't fully understand. The next day brought more progress on the porch. By mid-afternoon, the decking was complete, and Sullivan and Pedro were working on the railings, while Hannah painted the new wood with a protective coating of linseed oil. It's looking wonderful, she commented, stepping back to admire their work. I never imagined having a proper place to sit outside. Sullivan glanced up from where he was securing a post. Every home needs a porch. Gives you somewhere to watch the sunset. Is that what you do at your house? Hannah asked. Watch sunsets. A shadow crossed Sullivan's face. Not much. Too busy usually. Pedro, who had been quiet for most of the day, suddenly spoke up. Senor Valentine work too much. All-time work, no time rest. Sullivan shot the young man a look, but there was no real irritation in it. Someone's got to keep this ranch running, Pedro. See, but not only you, Pedro replied boldly. You need wife to make you slow down. An awkward silence fell. Hannah busied herself with her painting, pretending not to notice the flush creeping up Sullivan's neck. That's enough idle talk, Sullivan finally said. Let's finish this railing before sundown. By evening, the porch was complete except for the final coat of paint. Sullivan insisted on adding one last touch, a sturdy hook beside the door. What's that for? Hannah asked. A lantern, Sullivan replied. Every proper porch needs a lantern. As if on cue, Pedro emerged from the gathering dusk carrying a brass lantern, already lit. Sullivan took it and carefully hung it on the hook, where it cast a warm golden glow across the new porch. There, Sullivan said, satisfaction evident in his voice. Now it's a proper home. The casual use of the word home, rather than cabin, wasn't lost on Hannah. It suggested permanence, belonging, things she hadn't felt since leaving Boston. Thank you, she said softly. It's perfect. In the lantern light, she could see Sullivan's features soften slightly. For a brief moment, the stoic rancher seemed almost vulnerable. I'd better get Pedro back to his ma before she sends out a search party, Sullivan said, breaking the spell. Try out your porch tonight. Best time to sit is just after sunset, when the stars start coming out. After they left, Hannah did exactly that. She brought the rocking chair outside and sat watching as the brilliant colors of sunset faded to deep blue, then to the velvet black of night. Stars appeared one by one until the sky was littered with them, more stars than she'd ever seen in Boston, where city lights dimmed the heavens. The lantern beside her door cast just enough light to create a circle of warmth on the porch, a boundary between her and the vast wilderness beyond. Hannah found herself wondering if Sullivan was sitting on his own porch now, looking at these same stars, or if, as Pedro suggested, he was still working despite the late hour. There was something about Sullivan Valentine that intrigued her, his quiet competence, his unexpected kindnesses, the glimpses of gentleness beneath his weathered exterior. He was unlike any man she'd met in Boston, where polished manners often concealed less admirable qualities. As Hannah finally retired for the night, she realized with a start that she was beginning to think of this small cabin as home, just as Sullivan had called it. The thought was both comforting and alarming. She couldn't afford to put down roots here, not when her future was still so uncertain, hanging on the decision of a school board that might already be prejudiced against her. Tomorrow would be the test. As she drifted off to sleep, Hannah found herself hoping, not just for her own sake, but oddly for Sullivan's as well, that the school board would give her a chance. Thursday dawned clear and hot. Hannah spent the morning carefully preparing for the school board meeting, pressing her best dress and arranging her hair in a modest but becoming style. The application she'd written was copied neatly onto good paper that Sullivan had provided from his own supplies. At midday, Sullivan knocked on her door. Thought we might head to town early, he suggested. Give you time to see the schoolhouse before the meeting. Hannah agreed, and soon they were in Sullivan's wagon, heading toward Twin Pines. The journey was mostly silent, Hannah too nervous for conversation and Sullivan seemingly content with quiet. As they approached the town, Hannah felt anxiety building in her chest. Do you truly believe they'll consider me fairly? She finally asked. Sullivan glanced at her. The school's been closed for nearly a month. Children running wild is making everyone miserable. They need a teacher. But will they accept me? After how I arrived. Sullivan's jaw tightened. Some will, some won't. Mayor Johnson and Reverend Willis head the school board. They're reasonable men. It's the women you'll need to win over. They have the mayor's ear when it comes to school matters. The same women who pulled their children away from me on the street. Hannah asked wryly. The very same, Sullivan confirmed. But they're also desperate for their children to be learning instead of causing havoc all over town. Twin Pines looked different in the afternoon light than it had during Hannah's disastrous first morning. The main street was busy with wagons and horseback riders, women shopping, children playing. Several people nodded to Sullivan as they passed, their curious gazes lingering on Hannah. Sullivan brought the wagon to a stop in front of a small white clapboard building set slightly apart from the main businesses. The schoolhouse, he explained, helping Hannah down. It was a simple structure with a bell tower and a small porch. Sullivan produced a key and unlocked the door, gesturing for Hannah to enter first. The interior was dusty but well-appointed rows of desks. A larger desk at the front for the teacher, a blackboard, and bookshelves filled with readers and basic texts. Windows on both sides provided good light. Hannah moved through the space, already imagining herself teaching here. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Sullivan watched her from the doorway. 28 students when school's in session. Ages 6 to 14, varying levels. "You seem well informed about the school," Hannah observed. A slight flush appeared on Sullivan's cheeks. "I serve on the building committee, help with repairs and such." Hannah was continuing to discover layers to Sullivan Valentine, ranch owner, builder of porches, supporter of education. Each revelation made him more interesting. After examining the schoolhouse thoroughly, Sullivan suggested they visit the general store to replenish some supplies. Hannah was apprehensive about returning to the scene of Perkins' hostility, but Sullivan assured her the owner would behave himself. "Perkins knows I do a lot of business with him," Sullivan explained as they approached the store. "He'll mind his manners." Indeed, the shopkeeper was coolly polite when they entered, though his eyes narrowed at the sight of Hannah. Sullivan placed a substantial order for ranch supplies, then guided Hannah toward the fabric section. "Pick out something," he suggested quietly. "A new dress material, perhaps." Hannah shook her head. "I can't accept. Consider it an advance on your teaching salary," Sullivan interrupted. "First impressions matter tonight." Reluctantly, Hannah selected a length of deep blue cotton practical enough for everyday teaching but fine enough for special occasions. Sullivan added it to his order without comment. As they left the store, Hannah noticed the whispers and stares following them. "They think I'm your—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Let them think what they want," Sullivan said firmly. "Those whose opinions matter will learn the truth soon enough." They took supper at the hotel dining room, where the proprietor's wife served them with barely concealed curiosity. Again, Hannah was aware of eyes watching, judgments being made. Yet Sullivan seemed completely at ease, ignoring the stares and treating Hannah with formal courtesy that clearly confused the onlookers. By the time they walked to the church for the school board meeting, Hannah's nerves were stretched tight. Sullivan must have sensed it, for he paused outside the church door. "You're qualified, Hannah. Remember that. Don't let them make you doubt yourself." His confidence in her was touching and gave Hannah the boost she needed. Straightening her shoulders, she nodded. "Thank you, Sullivan." The meeting was held in the church's small side room. 5 board members were seated at a table. Mayor Johnson, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers. Reverend Willis, thin and scholarly looking. Mrs. Abernathy, the doctor's wife. Mrs. Campbell, who owned the millinery shop. And Mr. Peterson, a banker whose perpetual frown seemed carved into his face. They all looked up as Sullivan and Hannah entered, surprise evident in their expressions. "Valentine," Mayor Johnson greeted. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." "I've brought a candidate for the teaching position," Sullivan replied, guiding Hannah forward. "Miss Hannah Blackburn, recently arrived from Boston. She's James Blackburn's cousin." A murmur went through the group at the mention of James. The Reverend's expression softened noticeably. "James was a valued member of our congregation," he said warmly. We were all saddened by his passing. And his wife's, added Mrs. Abernathy with genuine sympathy. Mayor Johnson cleared his throat. Miss Blackburn, we understand you've been staying at Valentine's Ranch since your arrival. The implication was clear, but Hannah refused to be intimidated. Mr. Valentine kindly offered me temporary lodging in a vacant cabin on his property after I learned of my cousin's widow's passing. I had journeyed here hoping to stay with family, only to find them gone. And now you seek employment as our teacher? Mr. Peterson asked skeptically. Hannah handed him her written application. I was a teacher in Boston for 3 years. I'm fully qualified and experienced with students of all ages. As the board members passed her application among themselves, Sullivan spoke up. Miss Blackburn has my complete endorsement. She's intelligent, well-spoken, and possesses exactly the kind of character we want influencing our children. Mrs. Campbell raised an eyebrow. You seem very certain of her character, Mr. Valentine, after such a short acquaintance. Sullivan met her gaze directly. I'm a good judge of character, Mrs. Campbell. It's kept me alive this long. The questioning continued for nearly an hour. Hannah answered each query calmly and confidently, drawing on her experience and training. She outlined her teaching philosophy, discussed her approach to discipline, and explained how she would handle the varied ages and abilities of the students. Throughout, Sullivan remained silent but supportive, his presence beside her a steady reassurance. Finally, Mayor Johnson called for the board to deliberate in private. As Hannah and Sullivan waited in the church nave, Hannah whispered, "Do you think they'll approve?" Before Sullivan could answer, the door opened, and the board members emerged. Mayor Johnson stepped forward. Miss Blackburn, the board has voted to offer you the position of teacher for Twin Pines School, effective immediately. School will reopen Monday next. The salary is $40 per month. With lodging included, there's a small apartment attached to the rear of the schoolhouse. Relief washed over Hannah. Thank you, Mayor Johnson. Board members, I accept the position and will do my utmost to provide an excellent education for the children of Twin Pines. As they left the church, Hannah could hardly contain her excitement. I can't believe it. They actually approved me. Sullivan's mouth quirked in that almost smile. Told you they needed a teacher badly. But you helped enormously, Hannah insisted. Your endorsement clearly carried weight. Sullivan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. They made the right choice. As they walked back to the wagon, Hannah realized what this meant. I suppose I'll be moving into the teacher's quarters soon. For a moment, something like disappointment flashed across Sullivan's face. When would you like to move your things? Not immediately, Hannah said, surprised by her own reluctance to leave the ranch. I'd like to prepare the classroom first, get everything ready. Perhaps next weekend. Sullivan nodded, his expression unreadable in the darkness. That seems sensible. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the journey into town, both lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the cabin, Sullivan helped Hannah down from the wagon. Congratulations, teacher, he said softly, the lantern he'd hung by her door illuminating his features. Twin Pines is lucky to have you. Thank you for everything, Sullivan, Hannah replied, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. For a breathless moment, Hannah thought he might say something more, do something more. But Sullivan simply tipped his hat and returned to his wagon, leaving Hannah standing on her new porch, the lantern light casting her shadow long across the ground. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Hannah divided her time between preparing the schoolhouse and helping Maria with household tasks at the ranch. Sullivan was busier than ever, rising before dawn and returning after dark, often too tired for more than a brief greeting. On Saturday, Hannah asked Pedro to drive her to town so she could continue organizing the schoolroom. Sullivan had apparently left at first light to check on a distant part of his property. Hannah tried not to feel disappointed at his absence, telling herself it was better this way, better not to grow too accustomed to his presence when she would soon be living in town. The schoolroom was taking shape nicely. Hannah had cleaned every surface, organized the books, and prepared lesson plans for students of different levels. She was standing on a chair, hanging a map of the United States, when she heard the door open behind her. "Just a moment, Pedro," she called, expecting the young ranch hand who had promised to return for her at noon. "It's not Pedro," came a feminine voice. Hannah turned carefully on her perch to see Mrs. Campbell and Mrs. Abernathy standing in the doorway, both impeccably dressed despite the weekend. "Oh, good morning, ladies," Hannah greeted them, stepping down from the chair. The women entered, looking around the transformed classroom with critical eyes. "You've been busy," Mrs. Campbell observed, running a gloved finger along a desktop. "Yes, I wanted everything perfect before the children arrive Monday," Hannah explained. Mrs. Abernathy nodded approvingly. "Your dedication is commendable, Miss Blackburn." A slightly awkward silence fell. Hannah sensed the women had come for a specific purpose beyond inspecting the classroom. Finally, Mrs. Campbell spoke. "Miss Blackburn, we feel it necessary to address certain concerns within our community." Hannah braced herself. "What concerns might those be, Mrs. Campbell?" "Your living arrangements," Mrs. Abernathy stated bluntly. "While we understand your connection to Mr. Valentine through your late cousin, your continued residence at his ranch has become a subject of talk." "Malicious talk," Mrs. Campbell added, "which could undermine your authority as teacher." Hannah felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I assure you, my arrangement with Mr. Valentine is completely proper. I stay in a separate cabin, and our interactions are minimal and always appropriate." Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened slightly. "We believe you, dear, but perception matters in a small town. We've come to suggest strongly that you move into the teacher's quarters immediately, rather than waiting," Mrs. Campbell said. "Today, if possible. It would silence the gossips and establish your independence before school begins." Hannah's first instinct was to resist, to defend her arrangement with Sullivan. But she knew the women were right, her reputation would directly affect her success as a teacher. "I understand," she said finally. "I'll move my belongings today." Relief crossed both women's faces. "Excellent decision," Mrs. Campbell approved. "We'll help spread the word that you've taken up proper residence. It will make a significant difference in how you're received." After the women departed, Hannah sank into the teacher's chair, conflicted emotions swirling within her. Moving immediately was the sensible choice, but she felt strangely reluctant. The ranch cabin with its new porch and lantern had become more of a home to her in 1 week than she'd expected. And then there was Sullivan. Their friendship, for she supposed that's what it was, had begun to mean something to her. His quiet support, his unexpected kindnesses, the rare smiles that transformed his serious face, all had become increasingly important to Hannah. Pedro arrived precisely at noon, but instead of asking him to take her back to the ranch, Hannah requested he bring her carpetbag and other belongings to the schoolhouse. The young man seemed surprised but agreed without question. While waiting for Pedro's return, Hannah explored the teacher's quarters, 2 small rooms attached to the back of the schoolhouse. The space was clean but Spartan. A narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small cook stove, and little else. It would be sufficient if lonely. When Pedro returned with her things, Hannah asked him to deliver a note to Sullivan, explaining her decision to move immediately and thanking him for his generosity. Writing the brief message was unexpectedly difficult. How could she adequately express her gratitude for all he'd done? In the end, she kept it simple, promising to repay his kindness someday, and assuring him she would never forget his help when she needed it most. As Pedro drove away with her note, Hannah stood in the doorway of her new quarters, feeling strangely bereft. Progress had its price, it seemed. Independence meant solitude. Sunday passed quietly as Hannah settled into her new lodgings and finalized preparations for her first day of teaching. She attended church service, where Reverend Willis introduced her to the congregation as Twin Pines' new schoolteacher. Many parents approached her afterward, some welcoming, others merely curious. Hannah searched the church for Sullivan but didn't see him. According to town gossip she overheard, he rarely attended services, usually only on Christmas and Easter. She tried to ignore her disappointment at his absence. Monday morning dawned bright and clear. Hannah rang the school bell at precisely 8 o'clock, her heart pounding with excitement and nervousness as children began streaming into the yard. Parents accompanied the youngest ones, eyeing Hannah with expressions ranging from hopeful to suspicious. The day passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and establishing routines. The children were generally well behaved, if somewhat rowdy after their extended break. By dismissal time, Hannah was exhausted but exhilarated. She had successfully completed her first day as Twin Pines teacher. As the last student departed, Hannah began tidying the classroom, making notes about each child's abilities and needs. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear the door open. "Seems like it went well." Sullivan's deep voice startled her. Hannah looked up to find him standing just inside the doorway, hat in hand, looking somewhat out of place among the small desks. "Sullivan, I didn't expect to see you." She couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. He shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable in the schoolhouse setting. "Thought I'd check how your first day went." "It was wonderful," Hannah replied honestly. "The children are bright and eager to learn, for the most part." Sullivan nodded, glancing around the classroom. "Place looks good. You've done a lot with it." "Thank you," Hannah said, suddenly aware of the awkwardness between them. "And thank you for understanding why I needed to move in early." Sullivan's expression remained neutral. "Makes sense. Town talks less this way." An uncomfortable silence fell. Hannah searched for something to say that might bridge the strange new distance between them. "I miss the porch," she admitted finally. "And the lantern. The teacher's quarters are rather plain." Something softened in Sullivan's eyes. "Every home needs a porch," he agreed quietly. "Sullivan, Hannah began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say. "Miss Blackburn." Mrs. Campbell's voice interrupted as she appeared in the doorway. "Oh, Mr. Valentine, I didn't realize you were here." The milliner's eyes darted between them, clearly drawing conclusions from their private meeting. "Just leaving," Sullivan said shortly, replacing his hat. "Good day, Miss Blackburn." "Mrs. Campbell." With a brief nod, he was gone, leaving Hannah to face Mrs. Campbell's raised eyebrow and knowing look. "Mr. Valentine seems quite concerned with your welfare," the woman observed. Hannah busied herself gathering papers. "He's been kind to me since my arrival. As James's cousin, I believe he feels a certain responsibility." "Indeed." Mrs. Campbell didn't sound convinced. "Well, I came to invite you to tea tomorrow after school. Several of the mothers would like to meet you properly." "I'd be delighted," Hannah replied, grateful for the change of subject. After Mrs. Campbell left, Hannah locked up the schoolhouse and retreated to her quarters, feeling oddly deflated despite the successful day. Seeing Sullivan had stirred emotions she wasn't ready to examine, a confusing mixture of gratitude, friendship, and something deeper that she dared not name. As October progressed, Hannah settled into her role as Twin Pines teacher. The initial wariness many townspeople had shown toward her gradually gave way to cautious acceptance as they saw the positive influence she had on their children. The tea with the mothers had gone well, breaking down some of the social barriers Hannah had faced upon arrival. Yet despite her growing integration into town life, Hannah found herself missing the ranch, the open spaces, the sound of the creek, and most of all, the porch where she had watched the stars appear each evening. Her quarters behind the school, while adequate, felt confined after the freedom she'd briefly experienced. She saw Sullivan occasionally in town, usually on Saturdays when he came in for supplies. Their interactions were polite but restrained, as if both were aware of watching eyes. Sometimes he would inquire about her teaching, or she would ask about ranch matters, but the easy camaraderie they had begun to develop seemed to have vanished. One Friday afternoon in late October, as Hannah was dismissing her students for the weekend, she noticed Sullivan's wagon outside. Her heart gave an unexpected leap at the sight. Mr. Valentine, young Timothy Johnson, the mayor's son, called out excitedly as he ran past. "Are you here to see Miss Blackburn?" Sullivan, who had been speaking with the blacksmith across the street, looked momentarily flustered. "Just in town on business, Tim." The boy grinned knowingly and dashed off, leaving Sullivan looking uncomfortable as Hannah approached. "Sullivan," she greeted him warmly. "What brings you to town today?" "Winter preparations," he replied. "Ordering supplies before the first snow." Hannah nodded, surprised by how pleased she was simply to be talking with him again. "How are things at the ranch?" "Busy. Getting cattle moved to the lower pastures. Making repairs before winter sets in." He hesitated, then added, "Your cabin's still there, if you ever wanted to visit." The invitation, hesitant as it was, warmed Hannah more than she expected. "I'd like that. Perhaps tomorrow. Saturday afternoons are free." Sullivan's expression brightened slightly. "I could come for you around noon, if that's convenient." "It would be perfect," Hannah replied, ignoring the voice in her head that warned about town gossip. She had missed his straightforward manner and quiet strength. Surely a Saturday afternoon visit to the ranch where she had briefly lived couldn't cause too much talk. The next day, Hannah was ready precisely at noon, dressed in her practical riding skirt and jacket. Sullivan arrived punctually, helping her into the wagon with the formal courtesy he always showed her in public. As they left town behind, Hannah felt the tension easing from her shoulders. She hadn't realized how confining Twin Pines had become, not the teaching, which she loved, but the constant awareness of being watched and judged. "You look tired," Sullivan observed, glancing at her profile. Hannah sighed. "Teaching is rewarding but exhausting, and living under the town's microscope is challenging." Sullivan's mouth tightened. "They still talking?" "Less than before," Hannah assured him. "Most parents are pleased with their children's progress. That helps." When they reached the ranch, Hannah felt a surprising sense of homecoming. The cabin with its new porch looked just as she remembered, though the surrounding cottonwoods had turned golden with autumn. "Maria's prepared lunch," Sullivan said as he helped her down. "Thought we might eat on the porch, if it's not too cool for you." The thought was so perfectly aligned with Hannah's wishes that she smiled broadly. "That would be wonderful." Lunch was a simple but delicious affair: fresh bread, cold chicken, apple preserves, and coffee. They ate at a small table Sullivan had brought out to the porch, the October sun warming them despite the crisp air. "I've missed this place," Hannah admitted, looking out over the peaceful landscape. "Town is so confined." Sullivan nodded understanding. "Takes some getting used to after open spaces." "Do you go into town often?" Hannah asked, realizing how little she knew about his habits. "When necessary," Sullivan replied. "Prefer it out here." After lunch, Sullivan suggested a walk along the creek. The afternoon was pleasantly warm for October, the sunlight golden as it filtered through the cottonwood leaves. "The school board seems pleased with you," Sullivan commented as they strolled along the bank. Mayor mentioned it last time I saw him. Hannah smiled. The children are making good progress. Even Mrs. Campbell has warmed to me somewhat. Town needed you, Sullivan said simply. More than they realized. They walked in comfortable silence for a while. The only sounds the gurgling of the creek and the rustle of leaves overhead. Hannah found herself stealing glances at Sullivan's profile, struck by how at ease he seemed here, how different from his stiff formality in town. "Why did you help me?" Hannah asked suddenly. "That first day with Perkins. You didn't know me at all." Sullivan considered the question seriously. "Couldn't stand by and watch him bully you." He paused. "And once I knew you were James's kin. Well, I owed him. You mentioned that before. What did you owe him?" Sullivan was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower than usual. "When I first came out here 7 years ago, I was green as spring grass. Bought this land without knowing the first thing about ranching. James took me under his wing, taught me what I needed to know. Stopped me from making mistakes that would have cost me everything." He looked across the creek, his expression distant. "When the drought came 4 years back, I almost lost the ranch. James loaned me money to get through, no interest, no hurry to repay. Said that's what neighbors do." Hannah was touched by the story and by Sullivan's evident regard for her cousin. "James always was generous to a fault. My father used to say he'd give away his last penny if someone needed it." Sullivan nodded. "That he would." He glanced at Hannah. "You remind me of him sometimes. Same determination. Same kindness." The compliment warmed Hannah through. "Thank you. That means a great deal, coming from someone who knew him well." They had reached a bend in the creek where a large cottonwood had fallen, creating a natural bench. Sullivan gestured for Hannah to sit, then settled beside her, a respectful distance between them. "Why did you really build the porch?" Hannah asked, the question that had been lingering in her mind for weeks. Sullivan looked at her directly, his blue eyes serious. "Told you. Every home needs a porch." "But you knew I wouldn't be staying," Hannah pressed gently. Sullivan broke eye contact, watching the water flow past. "Hoped maybe you would. Eventually." The simple admission sent Hannah's heart racing. "What do you mean?" Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. "Not good with words, Hannah, but I've come to admire you. More than admire." He took a deep breath. "When you moved to town, I realized how much I'd grown used to seeing you, talking with you." Hannah was stunned by the confession, however halting. "Sullivan, I don't need to say anything," he interrupted quickly. "No, it's too soon. You're just getting established here. Just wanted you to know why I built that porch, hung that lantern." The significance of those acts suddenly became clear to Hannah. They weren't just practical improvements to a cabin. They were Sullivan's way of creating a place where she might want to stay, a home where she would feel welcome despite what the town had initially thought of her. "They said I'd never be welcome here," Hannah said softly, remembering Perkins' hostility her first day. "But you built me a porch and hung a lantern." Sullivan's gaze returned to hers, vulnerability evident in his usually guarded expression. "Wanted you to know you were welcome, at least with me." Hannah's heart swelled with emotion. All these weeks, she'd been telling herself that her feelings for Sullivan were merely gratitude and friendship. Now, sitting beside him on this fallen tree, the October sunlight dappling through golden leaves above them, she could no longer deny the truth. She had fallen in love with this quiet, honorable man. "Sullivan," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I've missed more than the porch and the lantern. I've missed you." His eyes widened slightly, hope flickering in their blue depths. "Have you?" Hannah nodded, gathering her courage. "When I'm teaching, I find myself thinking of things to tell you. When I hear interesting news, I wish you were there to share it with." When I watched the sunset from my window in town, I remember how much better it looked from that porch, with you nearby." Sullivan's expression transformed, the usual reserve melting away to reveal such warmth that Hannah's breath caught. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached for her hand. His calloused fingers enveloped hers with a gentleness that belied their strength. "Never been good with fancy words," he said softly. "But I think I'm falling in love with you, Hannah Blackburn." Joy surged through Hannah's heart. "And I with you, Sullivan Valentine." Sullivan's free hand rose to gently cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Hannah?" "Please," she whispered, already leaning toward him. Their first kiss was gentle, almost tentative, a question and an answer all at once. When they parted, Sullivan's smile was unlike any Hannah had seen before, open, unguarded, radiant with happiness. The autumn light was beginning to fade as they walked hand in hand back toward the cabin. Hannah knew they would need to talk about practical matters, her teaching position, the gossip their courtship would inevitably cause, how and when they might build a future together. But for now, it was enough to walk beside Sullivan, their fingers intertwined, their hearts understanding what words had only begun to express. As they reached the cabin, the lantern beside the door was already lit, welcoming them home. Winter came early to Twin Pines that year, the first snowfall arriving in mid-November. Hannah continued teaching, her students' progress bringing her genuine satisfaction. But the greatest joy in her life was Sullivan Valentine. Their courtship proceeded with the same straightforward honesty that characterized Sullivan himself. Every Saturday, weather permitting, he would bring Hannah to the ranch, where they would spend the afternoon talking, walking, or simply sitting together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold. Town gossip flared briefly when their courtship became known, but the honorable nature of their relationship soon quieted most wagging tongues. Sullivan began attending church, regularly sitting beside Hannah in the pew, which further legitimized their relationship in the eyes of the community. By Christmas, Hannah had been fully accepted by most of Twin Pines residents. Her teaching had won over even the most skeptical parents, and her obvious happiness with Sullivan had softened the hearts of romantic souls like Mrs. Abernathy. On Christmas Eve, following the church service, Sullivan asked Hannah to accompany him to the ranch despite the late hour. As his wagon approached the property, Hannah gasped in surprise. Her cabin was aglow with light. Lanterns hung from the porch rafters, candles shone in the windows, and a wreath of pine boughs adorned the door. "Sullivan, it's beautiful," Hannah breathed as he helped her down from the wagon. "Wanted to make it special," he replied, his usual confidence giving way to a hint of nervousness. "It's Christmas Eve, and there's something I need to ask you." Hannah's heart began to race as Sullivan led her onto the porch, where the lanterns cast a warm, golden light despite the winter chill. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Hannah Blackburn," he began, his voice deeper than usual with emotion. "When you first came to Twin Pines, people said you'd never be welcome here. I built you this porch and hung that lantern to show you that wasn't true, at least not with me." He drew a deep breath. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. You've brought light and learning and laughter to this town, to this ranch, to me." Sullivan released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small gold ring with a modest diamond that caught the lantern light. "I'm not a man of fancy words, Hannah, but I love you with all my heart. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy filled Hannah's eyes. "Yes, Sullivan. Yes, with all my heart." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of love, Hannah marveled at how much had changed since that terrifying first morning in Twin Pines. She had arrived alone and unwelcome, yet found a home, a career, and most precious of all, a love she had never expected. Sullivan and Hannah were married in the Twin Pines Church on a bright spring day in April 1877, with the entire town in attendance. Even Perkins, the shopkeeper who had once fired shots at Hannah, came to the wedding, somewhat sheepishly offering congratulations. After the ceremony, Sullivan surprised Hannah by leading her not to the main ranch house, but to her cabin, their cabin now. He had expanded it over the winter months, adding 2 bedrooms and enlarging the main living area, all without sacrificing the charm of the original structure. The porch now wrapped around 2 sides of the cabin, with the lantern still hanging in its place of honor beside the door. "Welcome home, Mrs. Valentine," Sullivan said softly as he carried her across the threshold. Hannah's teaching career continued for another 2 years, until the birth of their first child, a daughter they named Eliza after James's late wife. A son, James, followed 2 years later. By then, the Valentine Ranch had prospered under Sullivan's careful management and Hannah's organizational skills. The small cabin had been expanded again to accommodate their growing family, but the original porch and lantern remained untouched, a constant reminder of their beginning. As the years passed, Hannah sometimes reflected on how differently her life might have unfolded if Sullivan Valentine hadn't intervened that fateful morning in Twin Pines. If he hadn't built her a porch and hung a lantern when everyone else had turned their backs. That simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that sustained them through good times and bad, through prosperity and hardship, through joy and sorrow. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1897, Sullivan presented Hannah with a new brass lantern to replace the original, which had weathered with age. They hung it together on the porch as their teenage children watched. "Why do you always make such a fuss about that lantern, Pa?" young James asked. Sullivan exchanged a tender glance with Hannah before answering. "Because, son, sometimes the light that guides you home is the same light that shows you're already there." Hannah slipped her hand into her husband's, her heart full. From that first morning in Twin Pines to this moment 20 years later, surrounded by the family they had built together, one truth remained constant. In Sullivan Valentine, she had found not just a husband, but a home. The lantern still hangs by that cabin door, lighting the way for generations of Valentines who call that ranch home. And in Twin Pines, the story is still told of the unwelcome stranger who became the beloved teacher, and the taciturn cowboy who built her a porch and hung a lantern to guide her home to his heart.